I'll kick us off. I'll share, Jamie, how we know each other. Wow, it's been a while too. It's been, I guess, almost 5 years
Yeah.
since we've known each other. I was working with a portfolio company of the PE firm that's been my largest client for a long time. Alamo Drafthouse is the company. And if you're in Texas, you've heard of it. If you're at a major market, you've like watched a movie and drank a beer and ate a burger and fries there. And it's cool in so many ways. I had the privilege of working with you and your leadership team to help that org go through a ton of change and have been your sometimes official, sometimes unofficial mentor along the way. You've changed jobs over the past couple of years, been through lots of growth. I feel like I've been there, with you as support wherever I can. I've really appreciated, going with you on the ride and seeing the growth along the way, and just super proud to have you on this public facing podcast to raise your profile and share some of your learnings with our audience. And then Jess, like we were talking in pre-show, you met Jamie in those early days as well, right?
Yes. Jamie was reminding me she was in the OG cohort for PLA. And I was like, oh my gosh, Jamie's such an incredible people leader that I forgot that you were in the original cohort. And just to see how far you've come is really incredible. And we're so excited to have you here because you come with not only Alamo Drafthouse experience, but from a number of experiences in that space, from Sonic Drive-In, which I love eating at, to where you are now at Pursuit. For those in our audience who don't know you, could you intro a bit about yourself and your background? Yeah, for sure. So Jamie Thorpe, been in the HR field for now, call it 12 years, I think, give or take a little bit. So all in, which has been a ride. And I think we'll talk about what that's looked like. I started as a car hop in Sonic Drive-In. So on the operations side, did that for 5 years as I was finishing up high school, going into college, and then starting my first big girl job. What was really cool about that is the headquarters is actually in Oklahoma City. I'm an Oklahoma girl. So it was kind of fun to transition from the operations side and a franchise restaurant all the way into the corporate headquarters there, which is where I started my HR career.
You started at Sonic, ended up going into corporate. And how'd you land at Alamo? And like take our audience through, some of those first few steps.
Yeah. Well, one thing I think is probably fun to share and maybe helpful for those that are starting their career, if anybody listens to this podcast that is starting their career, is I knew someone that knew someone at the corporate headquarters in Oklahoma City. She'll laugh at this. She's absolutely going to watch this podcast. I sent her probably 5 emails following up over the course of a few months and saying, hey, I really want an internship there. What do I need to do to get an internship? And followed up and followed up and followed up. And I got it, which was how I got in the door. So I think persistence is something that I would share. As I was departing Sonic, I actually followed a leader that I had reported to out into the field to Taco Bueno. That was a 1-year stretch that I did between Sonic and Alamo Drafthouse. Went over there, followed a leader that I really respected and is a huge influence in my career, and then moved to Alamo Drafthouse as I was kind of transitioning out of that role. Just kind of got connected. I think networking is something that I have always invested deeply in and has been really helpful to me in kind of career transition. So another thing that I would probably emphasize for sure that's been valuable to me, and knew someone that knew someone and got connected with the Alamo Drafthouse opportunity. So that's kind of how I ended there and how I got the job at Pursuit as well. Cool. Can you tell us more about your current role at Pursuit? And for those who aren't familiar, what is Pursuit? Yeah, so I lead the people team here. It will be 3 years that I've been with the organization next month, which is really exciting. Led the people team here for the entire 3 years. Definitely had a major transition earlier this year where we were a portfolio company tucked within a publicly traded company and relaunched as a standalone public company. So big milestone and momentum for us as an organization. But Pursuit, what it is an attractions and hospitality organization. So what we do is we have owned and operated attractions, and that can range from, we have a gondola up in Banff, which is really cool. We've got a wildlife boat tour in Alaska. We've got a rafting company in Montana. We've got a geothermal lagoon in Reykjavik. So work travel is pretty sexy over here, which is never a bad thing. And then in addition to our attractions, we've got a ton of lodging properties, retail outlets, and then food and beverage outlets as well that kind of organically integrate into what we refer to as collections. So really, really exciting. And we're on a growth journey. We just did an acquisition of a beautiful resort in Costa Rica in July and looking forward to more and more growth to come.
Amazing. Amazing. When you first got to Pursuit, what was one of the first things that you did to sort of like get set up and figure out what needed to be done?
I think the approach that I've taken for any new role, but then particularly, leading a people function is just to get an assessment of where the function is at on a fundamental level and understanding, are we set up for what the mission and the goal of the organization is? So for Pursuit specifically, we knew, and I knew coming in, that was part of that interview process and the conversations that I had, that the organization was looking to go on a significant growth journey. And so coming in, it was looking at the team and saying, okay, are we ready for that? Can we effectively support that as a team and as a function? I would say the answer is no. I think everybody was unanimous on that within the Pursuit team when I got here. What was really interesting is Pursuits come together through acquisitions over the course of time. And so when I showed up, we had specifically in the people function a decentralized model where each kind of geography was operating as their own HR team and unit, essentially. So there's a little over 30 of us all in, and I would say that we had 30 essentially people generalists on the team when I joined. And so you think about that, you've got probably 3, 4, maybe in 5 in some cases, different ways of trying to do the same thing, but doing it a little bit differently, which obviously breaks as soon as you start to grow and scale. And so fundamentally, the very first 2 primary things that I focused on was, how do we organize the team in a way that can support that growth? So we did a lot of shifting on the team, created kind of these subject matter expert teams, and then have our field teams now, so organized quite differently. And then the second one was building the relationships with David, my CEO, and then with the larger executive team, so that when we were ready to launch these changes out into the organization, that we had the support going into it, because you can't do one without the other ever, as you all know.
This was not in our prep, so I'm going to catch you by
Oh boy.
surprise. Yeah. You keyed in on building relationships with the leaders. And I think this is really one of your superpowers, is building relationships. And I think it's often misunderstood by a lot of mid-career HR professionals. Like, to many like well-meaning smart people, building relationships means being like really available and really solicitous and doing all the stuff and working really hard. And I think you do all those things, yes, but I've seen you be more effective at pushing back, speaking truth to power, articulating what is really important rather than just doing the stuff that you're asked to do. Could you expand a little bit more on like what your form of building relationships is?
I think it's part of what you shared is one feedback that I've been given throughout my career, and probably more so over the last several years, is that I show up very authentically and very vulnerably. I don't know where that necessarily comes from, but it's just always been the way that I've showed up. And I think that that opens the door and invites a different type of dialogue with leaders that's quite interesting and that has been effective for me personally, I would say. So as I came into the organization, one of the very first conversations that I remember with David, I said, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much change are you open to and comfortable with as I kind of start to formulate a plan? And I remember very, very distinctly, he said a 15. And so just really understanding what, again, coming back to the goal of the organization, the mission of the organization, and then opening up conversations with leaders on what they're trying to accomplish, and then organizing a team around supporting those goals has been really important. So I think vulnerability and authenticity has probably been 2 of the things that I've leaned into as it relates to building partnerships and building relationships.
Love it. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that perspective, especially on the fly as well.
Yeah.
Another area that I think you are uniquely well positioned to share with our audience about is just like what's different between working at a private equity backed organization or a business unit that's part of another bigger company. What's different about being the head of HR for a standalone public company? Can you compare and contrast a little bit?
The thing that came to mind for me is the pace and cadence in which a public company is required to move. So you're reporting out on earnings on a quarterly basis. You're having board meetings on a quarterly basis. And so that alone just drives a level of urgency within an organization around what are we doing? How are we doing it? How are we performing on a very regular basis that I don't know that I personally experience in the couple private companies that I've been in. And that's not to say that there's not rigor and there's not structure within those organizations, but just in a public company setting, there just is a fundamentally different cadence in which the organization has to move. Expanding on that just a little bit is, for us as an organization, we have, what I would say I'm really proud of is one of the most robust business planning processes that I've ever been a part of. It's very comprehensive. It's very robust. We do that on an annual basis for the upcoming year and have very detailed plans that we're executing against, which I think also drives a sense of urgency within the business. So that'd kind of be one piece. And then for me, what's been different around where I'm focused and what I'm thinking about as a people leader is much further out from a planning and where we're going and how we're going to get there. Comparatively to when I was in, private organizations, my day-to-day was probably more focused on the day-to-day and what my team was doing and what the people function was doing and kind of what the next launch was or thing that we were doing in the coming month, 2-month, quarter type of time frame versus 1 year, 3 year, 5 years out, and how are we going to get there?
Do you think that's like a size thing, or do you think that's a public versus PE-backed thing?
It's a good question. Obviously, I can only talk from my experience. There's probably a component of both of those things baked within the differences between the two. I think just from a public company standpoint, there just is a much more rigorous pace in which you move and have to be thinking.
That's super interesting. I feel like that might be counterintuitive, where people think the public companies are big and slow and bureaucratic, and maybe a lot are, but you do have this quarterly responsibility where there are timetables set up around that and public commitments and investors really care. Yeah, really interesting insight that there might be more speed and for sure more structure with the public company world.
Yeah, this is interesting, but I also think it's very dependent on the CEO and the tone that is set at the top of the organization. So David is somebody that does not waste any time, which is great. And it's a style that I resonate with and do well with and under. I think that could probably play a pretty big influence, regardless of the organization, public or private, but certainly could change the dynamics.
I'm curious in how you, because of this different cadence in a public company, how your own time and planning has shifted too. Because you mentioned now I'm thinking out in 1, 3, 5 year timeframes more regularly than I would have in a non-public company. How do you think about, how to create time and space for that, further strategic level of longer term thinking? When and how are you doing your own planning?
Probably a more simple answer than you're looking for, but you just have to simply carve it out. Because if you're not making space for that, you're not adding the right level of value at this level in an organization. And so I think that it's incumbent on me, incumbent on other, heads of the people function to stop and make sure you're creating the space for that, because it's very easy, as any HR leader that listens to this podcast knows, to just get sucked into the day-to-day. There is no shortage of things to do in our world and things that people are demanding of us and things that people want. And you just have to hyper prioritize it and figure out what to say no to. It is my favorite thing to say no.
Love it. And just to be super tactical for somebody who's like, well, just carve it out. Like, Jamie, what does that look like? Is this daily, weekly, monthly? Like, when and how are you attempting to carve it out? And I know it's never perfect, like it exactly happens because we always have fires that are coming up that we can't predict in this world. But in an ideal world, what does your schedule look like for this additional time?
Yeah, I'm going to use a PLA term and say it depends. One, just blocking the time on your calendar, which again is super simple, but that you have to do. One of the ways that I love to work is working sessions personally. That is one of my favorite. That's how I've gotten so much exposure and learning myself personally. And so I'll just get a leader in a room for, a couple hours, full day, half day, whatever it is, and just carve out the space and just start talking about it and putting things on a whiteboard that we don't actually need to do anything with for 6 months maybe, right? But just starting the process of the conversation and kicking it off. I think then starts to drive a thought process, and then you get to iterate on it and have time to actually do it before you're asked to show up and present a presentation on what initiative you want to do, as an example. But yeah, everybody knows that sometimes there's priorities that can't be set aside or things that come up that you can't delay. And sometimes that time gets chipped away at, unfortunately. But I think preserving it as much as you can is probably what I try to do, at least.
So I'm hearing be proactive about getting the time on calendar and figure out like what works best for you. And in your case, it is actually thought partnership with another leader to be able to do that forward level of thinking. And when you said like it's couple hours or more, we need to give ourselves also the time and space for it to be a bit longer to get out of the headspace of the day to day. And if it's too rushed, like a 30 minutes sort of session, we aren't actually going to get to the level of depth we need to in the thinking. I wonder if we might switch gears for a second. A lot of your career spent in restaurants and retail, Sonic, Tonic, Taco Bueno, Alamo, and now Pursuit. What's distinctive about these industries that you don't maybe need to think about nearly as much in other industries?
Yeah. So for my entire career, obviously starting on the operations side, but then all of the people roles that I've held, I've supported hourly workforces. And that is by far the most distinctive part of the roles that I've held in comparison to, the conversations that I have with peers and what they're working on and what they're supporting or who they're supporting, I should say. So that for sure is the most distinctive.
And when supporting hourly workforces, we potentially have people in our audience who are maybe more in, workforces that predominantly salaried workers. What are some of the things that come up that would be helpful for someone who's making that transition into a company with much more of an hourly workforce presence that they should be thinking about or be learning about to be better prepared for that?
Oh boy, we could probably have a whole podcast just on that alone. Something that was new to me coming to Pursuit is housing. So we house a large portion of our seasonal workforce, which was an added component to the teams that I've supported in the past, just as a, interesting kind of example. But what I would share with somebody potentially transitioning into the industry is to take yourself back to the first job that you had, assuming that you had, a server job or any job in an hourly position, is just to jog your memory back to that and think about what are the things that were important to you at that time, because they're wildly different to the things that are important to you at different points throughout your career. And especially within a heavily exempt, if not full exempt workforce, it's just fundamentally different, like what is important to you at that point in your life. That ranges a whole host of things where compensation is much more important. The affordability of housing is a lot more important. So I hate to even, start to go into examples because there's just so many things that covers that is important to those team members. But for sure, I think that would be the approach and the mindset that I would encourage somebody to take coming into it.
Maybe just building on that quickly, I remember one specific example when you were at Alamo and you were talking about the potential to make a company contribution to the 401k. And that's something that the leadership team was really interested in. But given your workforce, which was mostly part-time and hourly, that might not be as high on their priority list as an additional 50 cents an hour.
100%. 100%. Every dollar matters when you're earning an hourly wage, for sure. And so that is the level of thoughtfulness that I think that you have to go into as a people leader supporting hourly workforces. That's exactly right. And yeah, Andrew, that's funny. I remember having that conversation where we were looking for different programs that would benefit the organization and our teams. And those are the things that you really have to start thinking about and weighing out is, yes, this is like a great idea in theory, but it doesn't play out the way that you might intend for it to. And so just starting to think about those things and where you're deploying your resources to best support and engage and retain your teams.
Yeah, it's such a good example too, because I remember when I was at Gusto, like for payroll, you have employees who are living paycheck to paycheck and sometimes need access to funds even before their next paycheck. So thinking about frequency of those payrolls and even having mechanisms to be able to access those funds as they're earning it, as opposed to kind of once a month or a couple times a month is very different. The other thing that's coming to mind too, just from like a hourly workforce standpoint, I know for like training, we had Melanie Naranjo, who's at Athena, which does online, anti-harassment and other types of trainings. And I remember with their product, they originally were having a lot of discussions with company that had a high hourly workforce employees. They were saying like, they don't sit at a computer. Like, how are they supposed to access this training? And then that brings up a whole nother thing of like, okay, well, make it available on mobile, but do they have mobile devices and are they company owned or personal? And so just to your point, I love the like put on the hat of the employee and like what are those elements that they're dealing with, because some of the things that are so almost like we assume like, oh, of course I can sign up for this online training program. But like even just thinking about that next step of like, well, how are they really going to access it? They're in the field is really, really helpful just to play out. So I think that's incredible to point out. Like the biggest thing is just go back into their shoes.
Yeah. If I had a nickel for every demo that I've done with a potential partner and we get to that point in the conversation of, hey, we have a huge hourly workforce. How have you solved for, the implementation or the communication component of it? And it's always, oh. And so it's a big challenge in this industry for sure, is just how do you get the information out to your teams in a meaningful way? And information training, fill in the blank with whatever it may be, but it's definitely something to give a lot of thought to.
I'm curious with housing, like just as a random tangent, but like what are some of the things that come up with now that you need to provide housing to people aside? I'm thinking through like, of course, the logistics of having to find the housing for them and then matching people to it. But are there other things that you weren't anticipating as you sort of went down the rabbit hole? And I'm just thinking of like pulling a thread of yarn or something, just more and more things are coming up.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different components, but I think what's unique for us is where we operate. So in Banff and in Jasper and in Glacier Park and in parts of Alaska, as we kind of go as far north as to Denali and as far south to Seward, is the availability of housing is actually quite sparse, right? And so you've got a whole front end component of where can we even find enough housing to put our team members in, because it's just table stakes in our industry. You just must provide this for team members as part of the experience for them to come over, and especially for international students that are coming over to us in the US and international team members that come to us in Canada as well, particularly. And then, yeah, to what you said, Jess, we're running essentially dorms, for our teams. And so there is all the exact same, honestly, logistics that you would go through to have a university style dorm situation and how you manage that internally. So quite the complexity to the business, but very, very valuable to our teams. Probably the biggest driver of team engagement and their overall experience with us is the housing that we provide to them.
Okay, super helpful just to even hear that analogy to dorms. And it's like, oh yeah, of course, of course. I mentioned up front that I am a Sonic fan. And for others who are also Sonic fans out there, what's maybe a little known fact or anecdote that you could share about the company that might be a fun thing to highlight?
Yeah. One thing when I share it with people that I think more often than not are surprised to hear is that prior to the Inspire acquisition that happened several years ago, it was a Oklahoma-based company, which I don't know, just always surprises people to kind of learn that it's based there. One other fun fact, for sure, when I worked there, I don't know if menu has changed and things like that since my days slinging tater tots and car hopping drinks out, is there was 1,063,953 different drink combinations that you could possibly make. There was a gentleman that worked for the corporation that put together that calculation, and then it was kind of a campaign in its own. So I'm sure somewhere on social media you could find that, but that is wild, just as a statement to make.
Yeah, and just to think about the customers who are trying to try every single one of those million plus combinations.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's also wild that you remember that years later.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it was the campaign because it was just so exciting to learn that. And fun fact for sure.
Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing more insight about like these hourly populations in hospitality, right? Like you've been in fast food, you've been in kind of fast casual movie theater slash restaurant, and now you're in resort experiences and the attractions associated with that. And a lot of our audience is more familiar with tech. Both your company as well as your function are still dealing with some of these bigger topics that affect all industries, though, like AI and tariffs. Could you share a little bit more about how your team and how you're thinking about HR in light of developments in technology and broader economic shifts?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd love to have, a really sexy answer for this one too. But the truth is, we are currently simplifying our HR tech stack internally, which is really great. We're very, very excited for the transformation that we're undergoing. So I would say from an AI perspective, we're very similar to everyone else, that we're dabbling in a whole bunch of things that everyone else is dabbling in, like using ChatGPT and other AI tools just to make the day-to-day more efficient. So I don't think that that's new or different for a lot of folks, but I would say that if you're not dabbling in it, you need to be dabbling in it like yesterday. And then for us, really looking for and selecting partners that have organic AI, roadmaps and plans of how they're progressing their own technology and software. And so leaning heavily into that and how we can utilize that. Culture Amp is, we've been partnering with them for a little over 3 years, and I'm going to continue to partner with them. So I'll just use them as an example. They've got AI coaching that they just rolled out that we're going to be rolling out within the organization. Obviously, some parameters and some coaching that we're going to be providing on how to utilize that in the organization. But that's an example of where we're leveraging our partners and our current technology and our future technology to drive us forward as a people team and an organization. And then on the economic or like geopolitical side, we have a very large workforce that comes to us on different types of visa programs. Particularly in the US, we are a very large seasonal workforce that comes over on J1 visas, our international students. And so for us, that is something that we're staying really close to right now, and just understanding what that's going to continue to look like. There are shifts in a lot of the visa programs happening, from small to adding fees to larger fees to totally potentially defunding programs. And so, yeah, just something that we must, as an organization, stay very close to, because if we have to pivot from a talent acquisition and recruiting strategy standpoint, that represents a very large shift in work for us. And then obviously operating internationally, yeah, tariffs are impacting anybody that has international operations or imports internationally. So we're not different than anybody else on that front either.
Makes a ton of sense. This is good role modeling for our audience. I love how keyed in you are on these broader macro economic issues, right? It's not just working down the list, the imaginary list of good HR programs that all organizations have. It's like thinking about, what do our workers that are in these types of jobs really need? How will these broader things in the world and technology and administration policy affect our company, and what am I going to do about it? So love the deep roots into business ops. I think we have time for a couple of our questions that might actually be most useful for the audience. Would love to hear, Jamie, if you're willing to share, a couple of your most formative or influential moments in your HR career. Like, help people figure out how you got here.
Maybe I'll start with influential people, and 3 people in particular. And Andrew, you made the list. So Andrew, I had 2 really great leaders very early on in my career. Abby, if you're listening to this, shout out, and Mary Ellen as well. Tons of great leadership that I've had throughout my career, which has been a real privilege and that I've been very fortunate to have. But for the 3 of you, the through line is that you all had shared your knowledge with me just very openly. There was nothing that you weren't willing to share, from real life examples that I have, kept confidential and have been really helpful in my learning, information that you've shared with me, and then just taking time to workshop and teach me things that were net new that I was doing. I mean, Andrew, when I was at Alamo, I remember not necessarily one particular thing, but just us spending, sometimes an hour together on something that I had never done before or was approaching that was net new for me professionally. Just the time that you invested in us talking about it and working through it and actually putting, words on a document or an email or a slide deck or whatever it was has just been exceptionally helpful. So I think for folks listening to this podcast, is find your people, whoever that might be, and people want to see you succeed. That's the one thing that I think is really cool and probably, just not given enough recognition to, is I think that when you ask, people actually really want to help and want to see you succeed. And so don't be scared to just start the dialogue and ask the question. So that'd be from a people side of things. One kind of moment in my career that I would say was probably the most pivotal was my experience at Alamo Drafthouse. When I started, I took on a people operations role, and then a few months into to the position and into the organization, there was a restructure that occurred and, ultimately took on the leadership of the entirety of the people function. So that was, battlefield promotion, if you will. And I think just a moment in time where I just really fundamentally had to think about how I was doing and what I was doing differently, and learned a lot on that journey for sure.
Those types of changes create a ton of stress and also create a lot of opportunity. We're talking pre-show about like how many people in high growth tech companies, come in as a recruiter and then surprise, you're now the head of people ops, or surprise, you're now the VP or whatever of, people and culture. Being thrust into those situations is challenging, and you've got to figure out how to swim. And you've been remarkably successful at figuring that out. I think part of it is finding your people. Part of it's your commitment to growth and learning as well. You were part of the first cohort of People Leader Accelerator. I begged you to do that, and you really engaged, and you've stayed connected with the community and have been a speaker and a role model for 100 plus people that have come through since then. I also know that you just recently went through the very fancy Wharton CHRO. It's like a specialized executive MBA program. Could you talk a little bit about that program and just what was great or surprising about it? Would you recommend it
Yeah.
also?
Yeah, for sure. Would recommend, I think, depending on what outcome you were looking for. So the reason why I went through that program specifically is we knew a bit in advance that we were going to be going through the transition that occurred at the beginning of this year. I have dabbled in executive compensation prior, and then also, been in a prior public company. So corporate governance was something that I was exposed to, but I would not have considered myself an expert in those two spaces particularly. And so there was a gap that I wanted to bridge, and that David and I talked about needing to bridge. And so I sought out a program specifically that covered those two topics. That's why I selected the Wharton program. Particularly for me, it was not focused on HR. It was focused on forming business strategies through the core content, which is the bulk of the content of the program. So extremely helpful at this level to just have a reminder of how to be thinking about these things, and where you're spending your time. Again, kind of coming back to that. And then, dove into those more specific topics and kind of the elective content that were really helpful to me. So very cool program, would recommend, but would also say that it depends on what you're looking for to get out of that. And would make a plug. Andrew did not tell me to do this by any stretch, but for PLA, because that was also exceptionally helpful in my career of just getting hands-on real life feedback, exposure, experience to content information. And then you, Brad, Carmela at the time, now Marie is in the mix, which is really cool, but extremely valuable in growing myself at that point.
Yeah. And speaking of PLA, I know one of the things that I've come in as adjunct faculty to talk about is performance, and having these like very engaging and thoughtful discussions about how do we get higher performance, takes on performance reviews. And I know you in particular have a bit of a spicy take when it comes to performance reviews. Do you mind sharing more about what this take is, and what have you done with this thought in terms of implementing it in your companies?
Yeah, I was kind of maybe hoping we would run out of time before I got to share my spicy take, but yeah, for sure. I'm just going to let it rip. I think that historically, I have felt that performance reviews are a complete waste of time in organizations, because they are an administrative exercise that I think organizations typically go through. And so I have not been a fan of them for that reason. Where I think that they can be impactful in an organization is when you invest the time and energy to build the capability of leaders in the organization to have effective conversations. Otherwise, I think that they actually do more harm than good when you don't have leaders that feel really comfortable engaging in conversations, good, bad, or in between. So that's the root of actually why I haven't historically been a strong believer in the performance review cycle. Particularly, it was funny, last year I had socialized in pursuit moving away from performance reviews altogether, because we were kind of in this transition period where we were moving from one platform to potentially another. And so I wanted to just kick it out there. Maybe let's just not even do it at all. And my OD leader actually put together a case. She was an advocate for it. She put together a case, and I said, if you want to do it, you must go build the most robust plan that I have ever seen to proceed with doing this. And she did, and she crushed it. And we got 100% completion of all performance reviews in the organization. It took 6 months to get there. She followed up. And then she invested a ton of time in manager training, building capability. It was a very successful process. I'm very proud of it. Probably the best one that I've ever seen run, to be totally honest. And I don't know, maybe now I'm a believer.
Can I ask? Because it's like we're getting rid of performance reviews, but you still had some kind of cycle. What replaced what used to exist?
We kept them. So I was pitching to get rid of them in totality, but we did actually end up keeping them in a formal form. Yeah, we used the Culturion platform and shifted over there, which is like a really great intuitive platform. And again, I'm not trying to plug in Culturion doesn't pay me for anything here, although if they want to, they can. But we shifted over there and it was just a really successful cycle. And we did do formal performance reviews.
Got it. Okay. Well, I think we have just enough time to squeeze in our accelerator round, which is just a few questions with shorter answers. Are you ready for it?
Think so.
What's a worldview, mantra, or value that you live by in life?
I think just that life is short. It's just way too short. So enjoy it and make the most of it. And that's not necessarily professionally related, but just a view that I hold.
And second, where do you learn from? What sources would you recommend to our audience who are eager to be learning?
I'm a podcast person for sure. I love HBR IdeaCast. That's probably one of my most frequent go-tos, just to name one. I'm an interesting learner potentially, and that I get kind of hyper-focused on a thing. So I did the Wharton program last year. I'm currently learning Spanish that I started earlier this year to engage in a meaningful way with our new Costa Rica team. And so that's what I'm kind of focused on from a learning perspective right now. So really kind of decide what I'm interested in learning next in a meaningful way and go for it.
Yeah. I love that. I love that you're learning a language to get closer to one of your international teams. I haven't heard that one before. Okay. Next up, what's one sentence of advice that you would share with HR professionals about how to accelerate a successful HR career in today's environment?
I think get deep in understanding the business that you are in would be kind of the one sentence. Knowing HR and being an HR expert is great, but it's just not enough.
Yeah, I love that. It's coming back to that empathy hat we talked about before of like, remember what it's like to be in that first job, to be internationally living somewhere in that role. And so taking that a little bit further to expanding to understand your industry, understand your business. And last but not least, for those who are excited to connect with you, what would be the best way for our listeners to be able to do that?
Definitely do not email me. I'm so poor. I'm not kidding. But LinkedIn is a great way to connect with me. I'm normally pretty quick to shoot a message back and typically try to just shoot my cell phone number back so we can text or hop on a quick call. I'm old fashioned like that, where I'd just rather jump on a call, chat about things and connect that way.
Jamie, just really appreciate you so much sharing your journey and your perspectives. And I don't know if you've like directly said this since we hit record, but this is your first podcast appearance.
First. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course you nailed it. And like really appreciate you paying it forward to the, folks that will learn from you. We're really proud of you. Thanks for being part of this. Can't wait to share this with more people.
Thanks for inviting me. This was fun and less painful than I expected.
Thanks, Jamie.
Awesome. Thank you.